To a introductory JavaScript tutorial for IAT 339. We're going to keep this pretty simple today, and one of the things that you'll see if you have downloaded the starter file and you are looking at it and working on it is that we've got a HTML file already pre-made for you, and in that HTML file things are pretty simple. We've got our responsiveness bit, we've got our style sheets linked as we always do. And then all we have in the file itself is our navigation section of the page, which if you take a look at what that looks like on the website is just a series of small links. And our goal today with figuring out JavaScript is that we are going to try and make it so that this small set of links are hidden inside a menu button, and when we click the menu button it will toggle these links and this nav as being visible or invisible depending on what settings we choose. So to get that started, we're going to use the same basic techniques and tactics that we've used with our style sheets, which is that we're going to insert whatever JavaScript we have by linking an external file. This isn't the only way that you can embed JavaScript in an HTML page. You can absolutely do it just in a script tag where you just write the JavaScript instructions directly into that script tag in the HTML. But just like with sort of in-page style sheets, the sort of modularity and ease of change with that kind of solution can be a little bit tough, so we're not going to do that today. The other thing to note is that when you are linking JavaScript files into an HTML page, there's generally two schools of thought on how to do that. One is to have you link it in the head, just like we do with the CSS and with almost everything else, because the head tag is usually read by the browser and it's read before the page loads. So in the event that there's ever something that you need to have running before the page itself loads for the page to load effectively and properly, then this would be a perfectly logical place to put a JavaScript file. The other way of doing things is actually to do it at the very end of things, down where the body is, or at where the end of the body is. The idea with this is we put a JavaScript link here if we don't want the JavaScript to try and manipulate anything about the page until after the page itself has loaded. This is particularly useful in making sure that if the JavaScript itself breaks or ruins anything, that the page still will work. It's also good for progressive enhancement in the sense that the page will work even without the JavaScript. It just won't work as it would if the JavaScript had been turned on, but turning off the JavaScript won't break the page load in the first place. The actual language that we use to add a script is a little bit different from how we do a style sheet, because when we do the tag, we're actually going to use the script tag, which has an opening and closing tag. But where we, instead of putting a bunch of JavaScript instructions in between those tags, what we're going to do is we're going to add an attribute to our script element, and the property of that attribute is going to be the path to our JavaScript file. In this case, of course, we haven't made this file yet, but we're going to in just a minute. So you'll see over on the left-hand side here that we just have a CSS directory and we have the drop-down HTML. And we're going to use the same format as we always do with CSS and images and otherwise, that we have those separate folders. We see here we've told this thing to go to the JS folder, so we're going to need one of those folders here. So for now, let's just go to New File, and then immediately I'm going to Save As, and it's going to be, because of where I had recently opened the drop-down file, it should be right where it's supposed to be. I certainly hope it is. And we are going to start by creating a new folder, which we're going to call JS. And then in that JS, we're going to make dropdown.js. And this is where we're going to put all of our JavaScript information in here. So within this, there's a few things that we're going to do to start, just to sort of make sure that everything's working and get you used to sort of how you work with JavaScript. One of the first things I'm going to do is I'm actually going to set a small instruction here in quotation marks that's simply going to say use strict. And the idea with this use strict is that We're going to set this so that anything that we're building in JavaScript is going to be sort of as clean a code as possible. And so this will help with sort of future friendliness and just general validity. And so we're not going to let our JavaScript use any weird hacks or sort of rule breaking as we sort of set up what we're going through. The other thing to know is that when it comes to JavaScript, it's got a similar level of sort of complexity of different things that can be done with it and things that are pre-built, just like CSS and HTML have. And there's just no way that I can cover everything in a tutorial like this, and I really do recommend that you both check out the many links on JavaScript that we applied in the course shell. You can also take a look at things like the jQuery links, which are frameworks that are built on top of JavaScript with a lot of extra functionality and sometimes simpler ways of declaring instructions that you can use, which can give you functionality and call functions and methods that you otherwise might not have access to. So we're going to go through this. So one of the first things to get used to with this sort of scripting language is that there tends to be a format similar to what we had with CSS, where we'll have sort of like an element and then we've got a series of instructions, or we've got an element that we're calling to, and how that works. In the case of JavaScript, we typically have something that looks like sort of an object, which is oftentimes going to be either a tag or a class or a part of the browser or something else within your HTML or your website. And then a method is going to be just sort of like what the function is, the thing that's going to be done to it, which is usually going to include some arguments, and then that call is completed. So as a good example of how that can look and what we're going to do to make sure everything's working is we're going to start by writing something where we're going to call the console object. So in the case of using Google Chrome, when we have the inspect tool open, one of the things that's often visible in the bottom quadrant of the inspect tool is the console. And if it isn't visible automatically, we can make it so that it is. And so when we're calling the console, that's where that's going to go. And in this case, what we're going to say is we're going to do console.log. And so what the log method is for is to write information to the console in this case. And so we're going to do that where our argument is simply a text string, and we're going to say JavaScript is running. And then we are going to end that with this semicolon. And we're going to save that just as it is. And now let's go back to our page here. And as I said before, so if we go to inspect and we see all this stuff here, and let's sort of move this in a way so we can see. And you see down below there's this thing that says what's new. So instead of the what's new, let's go over to the console, and we can't see anything because it's too small. So let's see what we can do to make that visible. There we go. So right now, of course, there's no messages because we haven't reloaded this. So when we do reload this, though, we'll see the JavaScript load, and we'll see if we get what we intended. And we do. So you see there, JavaScript is running, so that's written to the console. So that tells us that our JavaScript file has been linked correctly, and the instructions are being read in the browser, and the instructions that we're telling it to give us are output to the system. So that gets us our start. So let's head back in and try some things where we start to get a little bit more advanced. So the next thing we're going to do is, instead of selecting just the console, we're going to start selecting elements in our document. And so one of the things that we can do with this as well is we can select elements and we can deliver instructions, but we can also select elements and apply variables to it. And then those variables can be used in a variety of ways that they can be inserted into the HTML and CSS, they can be added to things, they can be subtracted, they can be based on user input. There's lots of things you can do with it. And again, I absolutely recommend that you sort of look up these in more detail. In general, one of the things that you want to do with the variables is if there's ever a value or a thing that you're going to have to use repeatedly, it will be generally easier to sort of set that up in that way. So if we're going to declare a variable that's going to be working on things in our later work, the variable is usually described where you start with the term var, which is sort of then, and then we end up with sort of like the name of whatever the variable is, and then equals, and then whatever the actual value is supposed to be. And that can be done in a variety of ways. You can sort of set that as being the argument of a particular method. You can set that as being something that's pulled in from a form field or something else. There's lots of different possibilities that you can sort of go through with that. And so one example of this that now we're going to do is, let's change this. So instead of var, we're going to say var menu. So the variable menu, and what is inside that is, and then we are going to do what we did before, where we're going to call an object. In this case, the document itself, so that would be the actual HTML file total. And we're going to say dot query selector is the method we're going to use. Sorry, get my capitalization correctly. And I'm going to say ID menu. So what this is basically saying is, because of the way that the document sort of model works, is the query selector is saying find this particular element, this selector. And so in this case, it's saying find the element ID, the ID of menu. Oftentimes with this kind of query selector it's finding the first element that contains something. So the order of things in your document and how you sort of set that up can often be quite important in how this exactly works. The bonus, of course, with a query selector hunting down an ID is unique. So not only will it find the first thing with an ID of menu, it's going to find the only thing with an ID of menu, because we can't have more. So now that we have this variable, the work that we were doing before, where we could say, pick an object and then run a method on it, is we can now call the variable itself. And so in this case, we could say menu dot, and then we have our method. And so what's going to happen here is, for us to be able to make that the menu sort of have a toggle that's sort of visible and invisible. What we're going to do with that is we are going to show and hide things by adding a custom class, a class to things, so that the attributes of sort of shown and hidden will actually be applied to things. And so to do that, we use a method that's called class_list.add. And then in the argument, we set what that class is meant to be. So in this case, we're going to set the class of hidden. And so that's going to mean that sort of by default, the ID of menu, if the next thing that runs is sort of like add this class, it's going to set that to hidden, which is going to make that hidden by default for our current purposes. So in addition to adding that class list, we're going to want to try and make sure that when we're working with this, and what we're doing is we're also making sure that we are keeping our accessibility controls working as well. So we're going to work with ARIA as well. And so similarly, as before, we're going to be working on the menu ID, but instead of the class list this time, we're going to set an attribute. And as you remember with HTML, there's the HTML element, and then each HTML element can have a variety of attributes. And so in this case, we're going to set a specific attribute for the element with the menu ID, and that is going to be, in this case, ARIA hidden, which should define that ARIA state, and specifically ARIA hidden being true. So the ARIA hidden state is set to true. And then we're going to set another attribute, and this one we're going to set as ARIA And so that's just setting up what the sort of label for the menu is, which should hopefully allow ARIA to work with that and describe it or do whatever is needed to do with the screen reader that might have to deal with it. Here's one last thing that we're going to do, and this is not going to be immediately useful, but we are going to make use of this in a little way. And so one of the things we're going to want to do with some of the stuff that we might do with this later is that we are going to try and capture a couple things. So we're going to add a couple more variables. In this case, we've got a variable which we're going to call menu first item. And what that's supposed to capture is, again, in the document, with our query selector again. This time we are hunting for something a little bit more complicated, which is look at the thing with an ID of menu and the anchor tag within menu. And first of type means specifically it's supposed to capture the first anchor tag that is a child of menu. So if we go back to our HTML, we can see what it's hunting for. So you'll notice here we've got this nav class box ID equals menu. So that's the thing that's being captured in the first variable that we were going through. And so if we say nav class box and we're looking for menu and we say anchor first of type, that's going to be this guy, which is that child of menu. One thing to note is it's not the direct child. It's technically the direct child of div, but it's the first child of nav in terms of what we go through. And so you see through here, there isn't any anchor that is like right there outside of it, but it still will look through this in this order and it will look for that first one. And so this button background 1 see a robot should be what's being captured by that. And then we've got one other thing that we want to capture, which is var, which we're going to call header. And that one's going to use the same system as we've already been working with. And in this case, because we're not using the little ID selector there, this is just going to look for the header tag, which if we go back to our HTML, that's going to mean that right there. So let's just save this, and let's see if anything changes over in our website when we reload it. Nothing so far. One thing we will note is the nav does have the class we added. So the question is, why is nothing happening? Well, it's pretty simple. If we go over here and we head to our CSS, we may find there's nothing there. Deal with that. Well, if we're adding a class to something, then there has to be something that class actually does. And in this case, the class would do something in the CSS. So currently on our dropdown.css, there's nothing specifically related to the hidden class. And so if we want to make things disappear, well, we need to put that in there. So in my case, I'm putting this right at the bottom, just before the media query that's sort of pre-set up in there. And I'm going to call the class hidden. And I'm going to set one simple instruction. Display none. So the bonus with display none is it sort of toggles the visibility of it, but if I remember correctly, it's also sort of display none. It just removes it from the document flow entirely, whereas you can also set something as sort of like display hidden, which would make it invisible but still in the flow. The main reason to use display none is that when it comes to screen readers, if it's display none, the screen reader won't pick it up as well. And this is actually what we want in this case, because these items are not supposed to be visible unless they're actually visible and usable to people, which in this case would generally be when also the ARIA role is set to hidden being false as well. So then those things together will work together to make things work from the accessible side of things. But with this thing set to display none and that file saved, if we were to go back to our system where we know we've got that class there, And since that class is being applied, if I reload this, now it does as we expected, which is that there's now no navigation. So if we want to set this up as we're doing, where the default state is that the navigation is invisible and we want to toggle it on, which is the thing that you'll probably find yourself with if you're using a sort of a mobile-first website where it starts with a sort of a hamburger or something else that's closed, and then you want to toggle it open or closed. Well, then this is where you're at. And now the question is, how do we make sure that the user can click and turn something on? Well, let's get to that. So we're going to head back over to our JavaScript, and we're going to have some sort of new fun with this in terms of where that's going to go in terms of the next step. And in this case, what we're going to start doing is one of the other things you can do with JavaScript is not just sort of like things like injecting classes into things and adding attributes and other things. You can actually add entire HTML elements to a page, and we're going to write something now that's going to do that. And the general structure of it is going to be similar to what you've been looking at so far. In this case, though, we're going to still set up a variable, but this variable is a little bit more fun. In this case, we've got a variable of menu toggle, and this variable will have, again, call the document, but we're going to create an element rather than hunt an element down in this case. And in this case, we're going to create an element button. So that would be that would get us a button element in the HTML if we were to use that. This can also be used to sort of add classes to things in this case. And so the way we would end up doing that is menu toggle. So we're calling the variable before, and we're adding a class to the class list for that, so that our button element also has a button class. And then we're going to set an attribute to it as well. And specifically, we're going to set an ID attribute, which is an ID of menu toggle. So then we get to have a different kind of fun. So like, if we're working on this right now, this sort of create element should create sort of like an opening and closing tag for button, and there would be nothing inside it, but we can start to set up more things like that. So we can say for the variable of menu toggle, we can do the inner HTML method, which will put things inside, in between the opening and closing tags of the button element. And in this case, that's going to be, oops, sorry, wrong thing there. And then we're again going to have a few other things go on here. So in this case, we've got our menu toggle needs a few more things for accessibility, so it needs a few more attributes. And so you'll notice that this says ARIA controls. And yes, I see the typo. I'm going to fix that in a minute. So that's another ARIA state. So in this case, the state is false. So now let's just fix this up. Get all that weirdness out of there. And make that hopefully work a little bit better. So the last thing we need to do is we need to actually, so like right now we've got sort of like all these things set up in this variable, but we do have to actually inject this into our HTML file. And the way that we're going to do that is that we're going to use a method that's meant to inject it into a particular spot. And so in this case, we're going to say header, because the which we captured before, so we know where the header is. And then inside the header, we're going to say insert before, and we're going to insert menu toggle before menu. So menu is sort of like the idea here is sort of like we're going to add this element right before this element that exists inside header. So if we go back, let's just save this just so we don't ruin our lives. And if we head back to our HTML, so this is header and this is menu. And so if this injects, we should see it between the H1 and before the nav of class menu, if this is happening the way we want this. So we will see in a second whether that works. So let's head back to the browser and let's reload. And we've got this menu button. Cool. Now inside header, there's that button. Notice that it's right before the nav. So now we have a hidden navigation area, and we've got this menu button. At the moment, of course, I can't do anything with this menu button. It's not causing anything. So that's our next goal. But so far, we're starting to get this stuff put together. So that's a good sign, and everything's still running correctly. So let's get to our last piece, actually like taking user interaction, which is the user clicking on things, and actually turning that into changes in our website. So let's go back to our JavaScript, and let's move down, and we're going to add a few more things. So in this case, we are going to get a little bit more complicated with this, but not super complicated. What we're going to do here is we're going to start using things that we refer to as event listeners. And so in this case, that can be a variety of things. It can be clicking of the mouse, it can be scrolling, it can be the window resizing. There's lots of things that we can tell the JavaScript to sort of listen for in terms of user interaction. Specifically in this case, we're going to be telling the system to listen for a click, and that's what we're going to be working on here. So to sort of write that up is going to happen as follows, and it's going to start as we always do with our sort of initial sort of selection and argument. So in this case, we're going to be selecting a variable, and actually I want you to be able to read this, so let's just go to that out of the way a little bit, and let's put this here. And so we're going to be doing this to menu toggle because we just made that button and we need that button to do something. So in this case, we're saying for the button menu toggle, let's add an event listener. We're asking it to look for a click. And then, oops, we got some stuff going on in here. And in this particular event listener, so when a click, sort of deal with what's going to come next. And at this point, we get to start working with the thing where we start to do more complex stuff within JavaScript. And in many cases, this is where sort of like when you get it more advanced, this is where you really get to start to play, which is when you start writing your own functions, which typically mean that you've got a sort of a series of instructions that you're going to have happen as a result of this. And so what the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to just test some things here. So right now our function's main goal is to capture clicks. And so we want to see that the clicks are actually getting captured. So we're going to do another console thing, and we're going to ask it to log to the console, menu toggle has been clicked. So let's just save that and just briefly see if that, oh, I should probably close that tag too. Let's see if that will work for us. So we reload and, boop, okay, I clicked it. I clicked it again, clicked again, clicked it again. So this is telling me that that's working. Excellent. Things are running. So that's step one. So if that's working, and that's all wonderful and lovely, now we need to start setting up more. And so this is where those of you who, JavaScript is a scripting language, it's not a programming language, but those of you who don't make the distinction between scripting and programming will start making your souls feel like this is programming when I start using things like if statements. And if statements work in JavaScript, and they work in Java, and they work in Python, and it's just part of life, and you can talk to a computing scientist if you want more elaboration than that. For now, though, our goal is an if statement, and what we're going to say here is basically if menu.classList contains hidden do the following. And in this case, right now, we're going to have some bit of test code in here again. So we're going to get some more console. And we're going to ask the console to say, here is hidden. And the goal here, by the way, is what's happening is basically says, if the menu is hidden, when a click happens, show it. And if the menu is shown, when you click it, hide it. Because it's a toggle, it's turning it off and on. So menu is hidden, showing the menu. And then how do we show it? Well, it's pretty simple. We actually go menu.classList, just as we were doing before. But instead of add, we're going to remove. And specifically, we're going to remove hidden. And because we care about our accessibility, we're also going to go menu.setAttribute. And we're going to set the aria hidden to false instead of true. And I should probably have that there and that there, because otherwise it's going to freak out. And then we're going to have our menu.setAttribute. So hidden and expanded's reverse. And one last thing to make the accessibility work best is we're going to say menu first item, which we captured before, which is the first menu item, that button item, and we're going to say focus. And so what will happen there is especially useful if someone's using a screen reader and keyboard. When we click the menu, the first item will be focus, and so then someone using the keyboard to navigate will be able to just move back and forth between the different items or click the first one if that's what they choose, which make everything a little bit easier for us to handle. And so that's the first set of things. So that's if it's hidden. And then, of course, we have our second piece, which is that we have the else part of the if-else statement. And in this case, we're going to get our console again. So if it's not hidden, then it's shown. And when it's shown, then we need to do the opposite. And we need to say menu is visible, hiding the menu. And to do that, we do the same thing that we had earlier on in our JavaScript, which is we do menu class list add, and we add the hidden back on. And yes, we could just copy and paste from earlier in our file, but we are writing it out by hand exhaustively because it helps our memory to pick this stuff up and get us used to doing it. So let's keep doing that. that should be everything. And if this has been done right, then we should go reload. There's our JavaScript running. Toggle it's open. Notice how it focused on the first one. It says hidden and showing. Click it again, toggles it closed. And we can just do that forever. And it all works. And that's your mem, and that's your stuff. So this isn't the only thing that we can do with this kind of work, but it gets you sort of like the basics. And funny story, I used to use creating a sticky navigation bar to do this, and that got replaced by CSS. And this hide and show toggle, there's a good chance CSS actually does that now too. I haven't learned how that works, so I'm still using this JavaScript to show you how JavaScript works. But in the end, you could be using this JavaScript for a image carousel if for whatever reason you feel you need an image carousel, despite the fact that Andrew and UX research and a bunch of other people say you don't need one, or whatever that is. But if there's something that you need JavaScript for, these are some of the basic sort of patterns and systems that you'll often be finding yourself using. But in the end, read. The sheer number of tutorials and resources on the web for JavaScript and jQuery is immense, and I do recommend that you avail yourself of that as you try and figure out what else you can do with this system. And we will see each other in the future. Thank you.